Marija was a remarkable woman, you know. I have never met anybody with so much of a sense of purpose and focus as she had. And I think that's what kept her alive throughout all of her many bouts with cancer.
Were you influenced by Marija's work?
Well, yes, I was, of course, influenced. Actually, I started my work, what's now 3 decades of study, not looking at ancient societies at all. I was interested in patterns, which is what my work is about. But I had a background in myth and in archaeology, and when I identified what I later called the partnership and dominator configurations, there was this nagging feeling that I had somehow come across this, not in contemporary societies or tribal societies, but in the myths that I had read about powerful female figures, about what we today call the goddess. And so I went back to that, looked at some of the latest archaeological work, and found Marija. I found James Maillard, I found Nicholas Platon, I found other scholars. But Marija was the one who really, she didn't really believe in just reading the captions to the pictures the way that she had been taught. She wrote her own captions to whatever she saw. And it was that, and her actually saying what the others were not saying, which is, hey, these look like societies where the relations between the two halves of humanity, between women and men, were different, and that this was significant. That, of course, tied in completely with my work, because that is what I had found, that when I compared societies that on the surface looked very different, like Khomeini's Iran or Nazi Germany, what was significant was that they shared a configuration, and a key part of that configuration was the rigid ranking of the male half of humanity over the female half. And as I looked at societies like the Scandinavians, where there is more equal partnership, completely different configuration, less violent, less authoritarian. And that she really also saw that this was a key element was very important to me. Because when I was doing my work, the question often was, well, I'm so far out, you know, so far afield with the conclusions that I'm coming to from all my background in sociology, from everything that anybody was writing, even feminist writings. They didn't make the connection between what was happening to women and the larger social configuration. And when I found goddesses and gods of old Europe, and then, of course, immersed myself in her articles, in her journal articles, which were really wonderful, from the Journal of Indo-European Studies, I found a verification of something that I had seen in historical and contemporary societies that I could only do by inference from the work of Maillard or the work of Platon or the work of other archaeologists. And yes, so Marija was very important for me in the sense that it gave me more of a sense of certainty about my own conclusions. And of course the richness of her material was invaluable. Well, Marija has been accused of, quote, interpretation. And the issue, it's funny, because what archaeologist, what scholar of ancient myths isn't doing, quote, interpretation? Everything is interpretation. Hers, however, was an unorthodox interpretation. And so she got a lot of flack and continues to get a lot of flack from people who are still in the old paradigm, where really women, the status of women, is a secondary issue. Marija was faulted very often for drawing from folklore, from myth, from linguistics, from her own background. I think quite the contrary. That's part of what makes her a better scholar than the others, because she used a more systemic approach. And if you don't use that approach, and I can attest to that from my own work, you can't connect the dots. You cannot see the patterns. Well, Marija had the courage to name what she saw, and to name it in terms that were not the same language that was used and continues to be used by much of the archaeological establishment. And to the extent that she did that, of course, she became more and more of an outsider to that establishment. Now, what happens when in a particular discipline data comes in that doesn't fit the old paradigm, the reaction historically has always been, let's not look at this data, let's deny the data. And Marija didn't do that. Marija was willing to shift to a different analytical lens in which women counted. You know that when archaeology already in the 19th century began to, when it was in its infancy, began to unearth some of the data that matched with some of the mythology of earlier societies, where a female figure, a great mother, played a very central role. They did a very interesting thing. They said, well, these don't look like patriarchies. They must have been matriarchies. So this really false dichotomy has permeated a lot of the literature, even today, and even in the popular discourse. And of course, matriarchy and patriarchy are just two sides of the same dominator coin. But I also wanted a gender-specific word, not just partnership society. And so I struggled with that. And of course, I went back, as we tend to do, to the classical languages. And I chose gyne, woman, andros, man. And then I thought, well, how do I link them? Well, in English, L is of course linking, but I wanted, but what I wanted was also, a classical term. So the word, the verb lios, it really is both analysis and catalysis, and that catalytic force of linking andros, gyne, led me to coin the term gylany, Gy for gyne, L for lios or linking, for the catalysis or analysis, and andros. And it's interesting, in Europe, Europeans love the term gylany. Americans but then Europeans still get a classical education. Well,
10 words or less.
in 10 words or less.
I'm just kidding, because I know it's a big subject.
Well, let me say that the question that animates my work, has always animated my work, was that out of my own life experiences, having as a child barely escaped the Holocaust, I really wanted to know whether it had to be that way, whether we have alternatives. And that was the question that animated my work. And when I became involved in the women's movement and really began to focus on, well, what we today call feminist scholarship, there was a huge piece that entered my world. And I began to intuit patterns. And so I pursued this work then very systematically, drawing from many, many disciplines. And I began to see that something that once you say it is very, very apparent, that the way that a society structures the roles and relations of the two halves of humanity, the female and the male half, is central to everything in that society. What kind of family it has, what kind of education, what kind of politics, what kind of economics, what kind of social priorities, what kind of religion. And I began to see that those societies, very different on the surface, whether it was the Maasai of Africa, or Khomeini's Iran, or Hitler's Germany, where there was this very rigid ranking of the male half of humanity over the female half, where the motto was, let's get women back into their, quote, traditional place in a, quote, traditional family, which we're unfortunately always familiar with in terms of every time there's a dominator regression, that becomes the mantra. That those were also very authoritarian, strongman rule, both in the family and in the state, and a high level of built-in social violence. Every society is going to have some violence, but here it's part of maintaining these rigid rankings of domination, be it man over woman, man over man, religion over religion, race over race, etc. And I became very interested in this, and I started to look, it's always a continuum, a matter of degree. I looked at the other side of the spectrum and I saw a very different configuration. I chose finally the term partnership to describe that. And of course, I believe, and I passionately believe, that today, what I've called the dominator model, which of course also includes man's once hallowed conquest of nature, is about to do us in at this level of technology. It was always bad, but the mix of high technology and what I call the dominator model is potentially lethal. And so as a mother, as a grandmother, I passionately care about helping to accelerate the shift that we're part of, actually, that Marija Gimbutas was part of, the shift from a dominator to a partnership way of structuring relations. That piece, then, that the archaeology, and particularly Marija's work, gave, added an element of life and of story. Because we have to have stories of origin. It's not coincidental that there is such an attachment to the old stories of origin, where we're evil. So we have to be controlled, right? And they keep getting resuscitated, like with selfish genes. What's the difference between original sin and selfish genes? Nothing. Same story. I mean, they argue with each other, but justifies a dominator model. And of course, all of these legends about women being to blame for nothing less than all of humanity's, or quote, man's ills. Wonderful mythology. So this is what fascinates me. And Marija's work really is a key piece in helping us do what I call the remything that we need to do to accelerate this cultural transformation. If you will, to reverse, in terms of the conceptual framework of cultural transformation theory that I've introduced, to reverse the shift that took place in our prehistory, which was from an earlier, more partnership-oriented direction to a rigid dominator model. Today, we're in the process of trying to reverse that shift, because many of us feel deep inside of us, as do I, that nothing short of human survival is at stake, not to speak of the fact that our full human potential, that potential that I see in my grandchildren, that joy, that curiosity, that love, that can only be liberated and come to full blossom when we complete the shift from a dominator to a partnership way of structuring our institutions. And a big part of that, again, are the myths, the assumptions, the beliefs. But it was very clear from reading Marija's work that there was an enormous symbolic significance for the people who lived at that time of these figures. And it's amazing to me how little attention other archaeologists have given to this. The dismissive characterization, for example, in the Paleolithic of these figures as Venus figures. And what's a Venus figure? I mean, it makes no sense. These were figures that symbolized the life-giving and life-regenerating powers inherent in woman's body. It was as clear as can be. Marija used what I think today we call a systemic approach, one that took into account not only descriptive accounts. I mean, I've just found a figure and it has 12 lines, and she'd contextualized that find in what she knew, and she had a rich knowledge of folklore. She was brought up with that folklore, which was a very fortunate thing. And she took it seriously. She didn't dismiss it as just folklore. And also, of course, she took into account linguistic evidence. So yes, because Marija was able to use a larger database, she could see things, patterns that others had not either wanted to see or actually not been able to see. And of course she also described, I mean, to me one of the most striking things when I read her work was how she wrote about how the old European civilizations, the locations that were chosen were not these fortified locations where, you know, top of a mountain. Sometimes it was the top of a hill, but as she said, there's no evidence of these huge fortified settlements. Now, Marija made some claims about artifacts that were found that were tools, not weapons. And so there's this huge thing about, did they really call her goddess or didn't they call her goddess? And who cares? I mean, they could have called her X, but the symbology is very clear. Feminist scholarship is to a very large extent systems scholarship, because feminist scholars, by definition, take into account the whole of humanity, both its female and male halves. Now, mind you, the focus of most feminist scholarship is on what happens with the female half. But in order to come to these kinds of findings, you have to look at the whole picture. So I think, I mean, the function of feminist scholarship is revolutionary. It's absolutely revolutionary. And in my work in The Chalice and the Blade, at the very beginning, I said, you know, that there were two major strains of influence on my work. One was feminist scholarship, because without it I couldn't have done my work. And the other one was, of course, this whole emergent movement that I'm actually part of. Of course, by denying that there are any categories, you really take things to an absurd position. I mean, there are some feminist scholars who claim that the category woman is meaningless. I mean, give me a break here. You know, obviously, it is meaningful. Now, it may not be the whole picture. I mean, a woman is born of a certain race, a certain class, but it's huge. What's the point? I mean, you have to move towards reconstruction. What's the alternative? Now, Marija really did see that you have to come to conclusions about your work, that that's part of scholarship. The great theorists have never said, well, maybe it's this, or maybe it's that, or it could maybe be that. They've said, look, this is what I see. I see certain patterns. And she had the courage to say, this is what I see. Marija did not buy into this. One of the most striking parts of Marija's work was that she said civilization begins in societies that are more peaceful. At least civilization always has been, and then by definition always must be, is this old way of doing things where you have the ranking of man over woman. That's sort of, it's the first centerpiece of the model. Then you have the ranking of men over men, and of women over women, and of race over race. And basically that it's, quote, human nature to be violent and to build violence into the infrastructure of society, which actually isn't human nature, but it certainly is the nature of the dominator model. It requires it. From my perspective, the critique that, women's spirituality, that's something that deflects from the real work that has to be done, I think it really reflects a lack of understanding of what it is that makes it possible for people to become agents for social change. There has to be some element of personal transformation. I think it's an enormous contribution, because we live by symbols. When I think of Marija, I think of this remarkable little woman with so much courage and so much determination. I mean, Marija was so directed. I have rarely met people with such a single-minded sense of purpose as Marija. And I think that's what sustained her. First, I think unconsciously, through the hardships of her life, and then very consciously, because she said, I want to live to finish this book. I want to live so that I can complete this work. And it's really a testament to the human spirit, how she did just that, came back how many times from cancer to complete that book. I think Marija deserves a place of honor in the history of archaeology and of feminist consciousness. But whether she has that or not now does not depend on Marija. It depends on us who have survived her. My friend Judy Chicago talks about how women are always disappeared. And historically, women have been disappeared. I mean, we know where now feminist scholarship is unearthing so many women who were so famous in their time, who have simply been disappeared. Well, the same thing is happening with Marija. The attempt is there, unconscious. It isn't like some person says, I've got to disappear this woman, because she's a woman, and because not only is she a woman, but she's a woman who had the courage to speak up, an uppity woman. But it's part of the system, and the system always finds people to do it, and unfortunately, it often finds women to do it. Women who think that by disappearing another woman, they will appear themselves, not understanding that historically they will be in turn disappeared. That's part of the job, isn't it? Is to change that consciousness. And of course, one of the important things is to have role models that remain, that are visible, of determined women.